The AWARE project's aim is to balance the public conversation about psychedelics, spread accurate information, and give a new face to psychedelia. We feel that this change will occur through connection and relationship, one individual at a time. We are calling on everyone whose lives have been improved through the mindful use of psychedelics to educate themselves and become ambassadors for the psychedelic experience. Show those around you that people who use psychedelics mindfully cross all social, racial, economic, and political boundaries.
All right, so hi everyone, I'm Ashley. I'm the founder of the AWARE Project. If you haven't been to an AWARE Project event before, we are a psychedelic society here in Southern California. We have events in this area, or the east downtown-ish space, and then also on the west side in Culver City. We do events approximately once a month. And our goal is to change the public conversation about psychedelics, to gather the community, to educate the community around important issues from the science to microdosing to shamanism to having these community discussions. So recently, before I jump into that, so because this is a public space, please don't come on any substances. Please don't try to buy, sell, or procure any kind of illegal substances. If you hear anyone asking about, oh, hey, where do you know a shaman I can sit with? Or please don't ask those kinds of questions here. If someone asks you something like that, please remind them of the etiquette, because we don't know. Anyone can come to these events. They could be an undercover cop, they could be an informant, we don't know. We are still living in the age of prohibition, so please respect the rules of our space, but we want you to come to bring your stories, bring your connection, bring your curiosity. That's what we're here for. So, okay, what are my other announcements? Move my phone back. It's been a scattered week. Has anyone else had a crazy week? Sure. Yeah, I don't know what's going on, the planets or the water or the air, all of it. Jesus. It's been intense.
We're in eclipse season too.
Yes, it's an eclipse? Okay, can we blame it on that? Yeah. Great. So just trying to breathe and keep it cool. And then you get swept back up again and you gotta breathe again. Okay, so community news. So we have some new integration circles that are going to be opening up soon by a friend of ours, Sky, who is with the I'm Alive Tea Lounge. So we're really excited for Sky to be able to do that. We have community psychedelic integration circles through Inner Space Integration, which is our sister organization. We have a whole network of people that from psychologists and therapists to acupuncturists and body workers and energy workers to support people in their integration process. So whether you've had a big opening experience and you need some grounding and some orientation, or if you just need community to talk to about your experience, we encourage you to come to one of our community circles. We have them in North Hollywood on the west side, and then Sky's going to be starting one up in the Los Feliz area, so that'll be kind of closer to you guys. So that's exciting. We've got some excellent programming, so keep in touch with the on Facebook, Meetup, and on our mailing list. Okay. All right. So in terms of so part of some of the community leaders and I have all been speaking about a number of really important topics. And which kind of spurred this kind of parallel event series that we're doing right now. So normally we do psychedelic awareness salons, which is where we bring in a speaker to talk about some aspect of psychedelia to kind of in a more didactic, almost sort of way, usually PowerPoints and talking and audience and everything. So we decided that the community needed to come together and start to support one another and to have conversations that are relevant to our community. And so we started this community dialogue series. And so in the AWARE project, in partnership with I'm Life and Plant Teachers, which Tony and Sita can mention as when they do their introductions, we started to create this space to do a dialogue. And so last month we did a dialogue that was around gender and sexuality and power in the psychedelic community, and it was a really great discussion. We did that in Culver City. The video is on YouTube and on our website if you go into our event archives, so I highly recommend going to check that out. And then Sita went through and pulled the notes out of that, so we'll have those posted too so that people can start. And I mean, there was a lot of really good suggestions, so how it's still kind of percolating how we want to kind of implement a lot of what came up and through that. And part of what we want to do is see what kind of other spaces we need to create. So these are kind of the two first ones, which was to just open up the dialogue. And then, you know, do we need to have a space that's maybe just for women that need to talk about sexual trauma, or do we need to have a space that's around, you know, how to be healthy, you know, a space for the healthy masculine, you know, or are there spaces like that that we can promote? So we're still kind of figuring this out, and we really want to engage you guys into this conversation. So with that, do you want to, is there anything else I should say, or should I just hand it over and we can, and then Sita, you can give, and Sita can give the update? Okay. So I'm going to hand over the mic. This is Sita and Tony. I'm so thrilled to continue to produce and to co-create with these two. It's been a really great couple of years, and just continues. So yeah, it's just really lovely to continue doing this stuff with you guys.
Sweet. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming out to engage in this important conversation. And before we open up the topic of tonight's community dialogue and discussion, I'd like to provide a few bits of information, some updates that fall in alignment with the community dialogue discussion. Number one, which had to do, you know, with sexual dynamics and abuse of power and sexual misconduct. And there is a person in the local community who was arrested and charged with rape, and this person was a practitioner. And the update is, you know, he's being held in jail, which is where they hold people prior to trial, and he had a preliminary hearing, meaning that the charges were read and there was preliminary testimony so that the court could decide whether or not to hold him over for trial on the charges. And so there was a rape charge, and then as a result of the prelim, there was an additional charge of kidnapping. And I'll just take a moment to explain that, you know, for many of us, we think about kidnap or rape in a certain way, and the law and the state of California laws, you know, are very specific and oftentimes very inclusive. So just to know, like this kidnapping charge, taking somebody from one room to another and demanding something in exchange for your release is a kidnap. So he's facing both kidnap and a rape charge, which carries a sentence, a maximum potential sentence of life. And in California, unfortunately, the way the laws are written, if you get an indeterminate life sentence, meaning like 7 to life or 12 to life, you very rarely get paroled, and you wind up doing life. So, you know, we touched on alternatives to that in the last conversation, having to do with, you know, truth and reconciliation committees and restorative justice and what really promotes healing. And certainly each person has the option to determine what route they want to go and whether or not they want to report to, you know, what somebody called in that discussion sort of like, you know, the outside, right, and into the system. But, you know, creating an infrastructure or a way for us to support somebody so that they can make an informed choice, because so often, first off, people don't report because they think, oh, I've done something that, you know, isn't legal, so I have no voice and no agency to speak about it to anybody. And then, you know, who do I talk about it to, and what are my options? So to say that, and also to note that barring a specific professional license, you know, and we can ask before we have a conversation with someone, you know, there are no like reporting requirements. So if I go to someone and I say, hey, I've been raped and I need some crisis intervention, that person is not required to report that crime. So just to give that bit of information so that people can maybe feel more comfortable, speaking about, their experiences, whether they rise to the level of what would be considered a crime in the criminal code of conduct or not. But just to provide that follow-up, so it's pretty grave condition when, someone who is a practitioner, is now on trial, with a potential life sentence. Now, there may be a negotiated settlement, and because he's represented by counsel, there isn't a lot that, we're not privy to, attorney-client privileged information. But did want to give that report and to be mindful of what kind of options do we want to create in addition to the criminal justice system that is currently in place. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony to introduce himself, and actually maybe I'll introduce myself and then turn it over to you.
You can transition from that.
Yes, so yeah, there's a lot. As you know, my name is Sita, and I founded an organization called Plant Teachers, and the mission statement is to cultivate entheogenic awareness. A few years ago, I produced Visionary Convergence, which was a conference here in LA dedicated to cultivating entheogenic awareness and also asking ourselves as a community, what does it mean to heal? What do we mean, when we say medicine in the 21st century? What are the new frontiers of therapeutic process, traditional plant medicines, psychedelic psychotherapy, and religion? How do we want to be part of the culture that gets to redefine this? And what is the culture that we want to live into? So I've been in, the plant medicine arena since 1998, and have spent a lot of time in Peru and a lot of time in LA. And hopefully I can be of service in some way in helping to facilitate the important conversation tonight around disenfranchised populations, race, and gender identification and orientation. Thank you.
Thank you, as always. The reason I said I need a little bit of a transition is because, like a lot of people, at least a few of us in the room, we had a close relationship with the person who's facing those charges. And it's an interesting thing to bring up. And what I think is most important is for all the people that I think occasionally cross those lines when you're working as a practitioner, and kind of think that it's harmless even if you've done some harm. This is a really powerful wake-up call that it's actually not okay. It's tough, So again, my name is Tony Moss. I'm the founder of I Am Life. I Am Life is a nonprofit production company. We focus on events that increase interconnectivity, and we basically produce public ceremonies. We have done this beautiful fusion of indigenous ceremony with kind of contemporary ceremony and technology to bring people into a community ceremony space, because we found that's the most powerful place for people to connect and to kind of move them into the broader conversation about what's happening on the planet in terms of how to participate in what you've really mentioned, which is creating this new story we want to live into. And we've also just launched with that a music label that basically will be supporting all the work that we do because it's all music driven. So everything we do basically is a utilization of media to get this message out, basically. One of the cornerstones of all the work that we do is bridging our relationship with indigenous cultures, particularly because a lot of our work was founded with our work with plant medicines and psychedelics. And we're committed to this concept of the Eagle Condor prophecy, which is basically bringing together the North and the South. So with that, I've been working with plant medicines now for 24 years, and am a strong public advocate for the legalization of all plant medicines in what we call right relationship, which is a whole other...
Jazz fingers from...
It's good to see you again, by the way. It's been a while. We saw it in Brazil last. Oh, here, probably. So that's what I'm up to. And a lot of the members of the I Am Life team are here, and we're really, really happy to be supporting this event. And we also supported CETA and Plant Medicines, which produced our conference. Yeah, so it's very exciting. What I love most about the AWARE project is that it's community. The topics are universal, and people listening in all benefit, but this is really about what's happening in Southern California in our community. Right? So that said, tonight's topic is a really, it's a broad one, and it's one that comes up all the time. It's very important. And basically, it's about the diversity and inclusion, right? The interesting thing about this kind of what we're calling a psychedelic renaissance, and the resurgence of interest in indigenous, both shamanic culture and I would say spiritual cosmology, is that if you're involved in that at all, and if you're really an advocate for it, it's because you realize the potential for psychedelic work and particularly ceremonial use of plant medicines for elevating and transforming consciousness, which is literally a way that we can elevate and transform the consciousness on the planet. And the fascinating thing about that is that it's mostly white people doing it. Right, so, we talked about this a little bit before. We don't have answers to this. We just know that it's something that particularly, there is more diversity in this room than there is in probably any other community that I have encountered anyway that does similar work. So it's not such a pressing issue in LA, but it is in general if you are a supporter of this work, right? The other thing about that is that, once again, and this is something that's obvious that always comes up, is we're talking predominantly, of course psychedelics are in a different category, but even they're derived from plant medicines predominantly. And we're looking again at this amazing transformational tool that is growing exponentially in popularity that, once again, we have adapted or taken from indigenous people, and they're kind of not invited to the party, right? So that's what we want to talk about as a community. And I think the goal really is for us to make sure that we stay conscious and rooted in this conversation, that it doesn't become something that's elitist, that just a few people are benefiting from, and particularly maybe a section of our community. As Sita said earlier, yes, this work is amazing, and maybe it's because we're still in the developing stages, but the true potential of plant medicine and psychedelic work really won't be realized until, as you said, we have a group of black kids from South Central or anywhere else that can go and have access to a ceremony that's appropriate for them, tailored to their needs so that they can work through their own trauma. So this is a long-term conversation. MAPS is involved in it. A lot of different organizations, ICERS, of course. So this is just our kind of community dialogue and contribution to a larger conversation.
Okay,
Want to go to the next?
Paola, can you take yourself off mute and introduce yourself?
Hi. So to give a little disclaimer, your hands.
Okay.
Pray that the connection gets better.
One recommendation, Paula, might be to, just while you're speaking, to shut the video off. Sometimes that makes the connection more straightforward.
Awesome.
Oh, that's better.
Great. How's that?
Much better.
Oh, awesome. Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Paula. My preferred gender pronouns are she and they. And I'm so excited to join you all today. My teenage self, my 14, 15, 16 to 21-year-old self is so blessed to be with you, because this has been an issue been coming up in my life for over a decade. And I began medicating at a young age, and I would attend raves and festivals, and I had so many encounters with oppression, whether it was gender or racial marginalization in these spaces where I sought embodied freedom, that I felt in my heart that I sooner or later would have to address it. And I was really blessed to get in touch with Ismael and Natalie at MAPS, who I was able to really align myself with and build solidarity and since they were able to forge this opportunity for scholarship recipients to attend the MAP Psychedelic Science conference in April 2017. I've just been reawakened to a world of psychedelic research and drug policy, and yet I still continue to see that these spaces are monopolized by a particular demographic, and I have noticed that there are certain voices that are louder in those spaces, and I continue to see that there is a disconnection between indigenous communities and communities that have historically been the most impacted and continue to be the most disproportionate. And so in order to address that and to create counter narratives, I launched an organization called Cosmovisiones Ancestrales, and it's an effort to both provide anti-oppression and consent education to address sexual to guide psychedelic consumers and psychedelic researchers and mental health professionals to work with indigenous communities that have inherited ancestral medicine, and to also incorporate an anti-oppression framework into their research. So that's where I'm coming from. I hope that wasn't too choppy, and I'm currently in Huautla, Oaxaca for a festival that will be honoring the life of Maria Sabina, and I can talk more about that later.
Awesome. Thank you, Paula. Izzy?
Yeah, totally. Hi. And Paula also, yeah, okay, you've got it. Hi, everyone. My understanding is that based on from what I can see, my image is above Tony and Sita, so I can't see you all, but I'm waving hello in your direction. Hi, everyone. My name is Ismael Loido Ali. I'm based in the Bay Area in California also. I would love to be there in person, and I hope at some point in the future to be there in the future, to be there in person with you. But I'm glad that Ashley and Tony are putting this together and that I was able to join tonight. I am here for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, I think because I am on my own healing journey and personal path toward unraveling and deconstructing a history of trauma and oppression that's not just articulated itself in my own experience, but also kind of clearly popping up in every single direction, everywhere else and I think we're all looking. So formally, I work as a policy and advocacy counsel at MAPS, which means that my background is in law, human rights, and policy. And most of the work that I do is in kind of the legal advocacy realm, focusing primarily on creating and supporting the regulatory structures for the legalization of psychedelic medicine and substances over time, and also kind of challenging barriers to scientific research when it comes to the actual kind of FDA-approved process, which is a significant but only small, I would say, sliver of this larger conversation.
Izzy, could you tell us what MAPS is?
Absolutely, yes, thank you. So the nonprofit that I work for is called the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, also lovingly referred to as MAPS, I'll say. You can find more information at maps.org. And the kind of the primary purpose of MAPS is to create legal, cultural frameworks for the intentional use of psychedelics and cannabis. And we've been around for about 32 years. I've been working with MAPS for just about 2 or 3. I've been in the drug policy world for a little bit longer than that. And MAPS's kind of flagship project is taking MDMA and maybe eventually cannabis and possibly eventually ibogaine through the FDA approval process, so they're approved as medicine to be available for various indications. But in addition to that like flagship work with the FDA, MAPS has also been kind of a hub for harm reduction, psychedelic education, and literacy for the last. In addition to the work that I do with MAPS, which, like I said, kind of focuses more on the legal policy advocacy realm, community building work. I also work with the Ayahuasca Defense Fund on their steering committee, looking at specifically the instances in which people who work with plant medicine, primarily ayahuasca, but really a lot of others also, when they face legal prosecution all over the world, and supporting the education of judges and attorneys and people who are involved in those cases, so they know, just for example, that DMT and ayahuasca are not the same, and that people who are using ayahuasca in ceremony are in many ways different from people who are buying and selling and manufacturing DMT, just as an example. And I'll say that even those distinctions, that distinction between like the molecule itself and the plant and the culture and tradition that surrounds it, that all of those pieces are what ties into this conversation, to how we talk about the substances, even using the word psychedelic, even using the word renaissance, the implication of this kind of European process, like kind of centering those narratives in this whole conversation as like we get this global awareness and increase in consciousness, as kind of Tony, I think, really accurately described. And lastly, in addition to all that, I also work with the Students for Sensible Drug Policy. I'm the chair of the board of directors for that organization as well. And that's a global student organizing platform to end the war on drugs. So we work with students from all over the world. There are chapters all over the United States, and I think something in 26 or 28, almost 30 countries now, that are actively kind of pursuing the end of the war on drugs and finding alternative systems to regulate, to create points of access, and to eventually be a lot more creative about how we handle altered states and the substances that cause them and the people over the course of time. We're really trying to seek more creative alternatives to prohibition and to criminalization. So I have different roles in this field. I'm passionate as a drug policy reformer, and part of the reason I'm really excited to be here is because, as Paula said, as Sita and Tony have said, the issues around race and gender and inclusion and the conversation, this ongoing dialogue about how we deal with, I'm kind of starting to see as this collective social shadow, this thing that's kind of needing to come up, needing to be metabolized and maybe purged by society. I see as a huge opportunity to kind of have a point of entry into a lot of other deeper conversations that are not only about psychedelics, right, that are about topics that are much greater and much bigger. So I'm excited for the questions. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for the opportunity, everybody, and I'm happy to kind of get involved as we.
Great.
Thanks, Susie.
Don't point it at the speaker. Okay. So, one of the things that I was sharing with Tony before we got started was, my own personal awareness that I am a white person of privilege, and the task that it is for me, if I want to be a good citizen and a good member of the community, to remember that. And I do a lot of transformational work in the legal arena, working with teams of people that are representing people on death row. And we always do a breakout brainstorming session on race, and we'll get into the room, and I'm sitting at the table, and it's kind of a hot spot, right? Because who wants to talk about race, right? Oftentimes, I would say 80% of the people don't want to talk about it. And we'll get in there, and we're all white, and somebody will say, oh, my client's white, and we're all white, so there's no racial issue here. Or, my client, is African American, and so am I, so there's no racial issue here. So I think, for me, what I've noticed in the years of doing the work that I've done is race is always an issue, and it's always something that I think we need to challenge ourselves to talk about, even when it's incredibly uncomfortable. And what's relevant to me in terms of plant medicine is, what's most relevant right now are the two things, right? So we're carrying this legacy, culture is ever emerging and transforming, so these practices, as they grow and blend and merge in this, global existence that we have now, how are we thoughtful, how are we mindful about the source of this, and how do we not just in our head say, oh, well, it seems like this would be a good thing, but to be in dialogue with people whose medicines, they were/are, how are we respectful and how do we invite, everyone to the party? And then the other thing is, looking around the spaces, whether it's here or in ceremonial spaces or other places where the entheogenic conversation is taking place, and just noticing, right? So, one other thing I'll say, in the course of my career doing death penalty work, I spent a lot of time in the Deep South. And I would sometimes go to these little towns, and there were people there who had never actually seen, touched, talked to a living, breathing white person before, right? Right? Exactly. And you know what? And I was the one who was different, and so I always remember that. So and that helps me, right? That helps me because you know what? I'm never going to be black. I'm never going to be a person of color, right? But I want to know a little bit, what might your experience be like to be in a place where you are the only person of color, or you are the only person who identifies as transgender, or whatever the case might be. So I think for me, two things, this how do we just cultivate our own personal mindfulness that we're not all the same, and there are different things that are important to different people, and how do we continue to make contributions to empower everyone. So I'd love to hear, who has ideas or experiences about that, and then, kind of my personal thing about, race always being part of the conversation, at large in the world and in our community. So.
Yeah, it's a tricky conversation. I was just thinking while you were speaking about the very nature of a psychedelic, entheogenic, we'll just say, transformational experience is that you quickly move into a place of it's all one, right? Yeah, and all of the racism and the ideas of separation drop away really quickly. And that's a beautiful thing. And then you realize in that process that you're in a room predominantly filled with white people. Typically, right? So what does that actually really mean? The other thing is, asking ourselves, which is what I want to ask Izzy and I forgot Paula, why are we even talking about this? In other words, why is this important? Why is this a topic that we should be in a community concerned with? If our community is predominantly white, with a few, other GLTB and, ethnicities mixed in, and that's kind of what's showing up, should we even care, right? That's one of the things I want to ask you guys about. Is it even relevant, And the other, probably turn over to Paula, I think. A couple of years back, it might have been 3, we've worked every year with the Lucidity Festival to help produce one of the camps there. And one of the years they were asking the question, why is the Lucidity Festival more diverse? Why is it predominantly white? Because they're very, very open. And the answer that came back was, it's look at your marketing, right? People of color look at posters of a bunch of amazing, beautiful, hippie white people at a festival, and if they don't see themselves, the message is, that's not a place my people go to, right? So if you want to have more diversity, it needs to look like it's inviting diversity, or that it's already there, even if it isn't, right? True, right? Because you want to, hey, this is a very inclusive place, and you're all invited, and look, there's amazing, beautiful black people, and Mexican people, and transgender people all having a good time together. Then they see that and they're like, oh, I'm going to consider going, Needless to say, we can't do that in the psychedelic and entheogenic communities. There aren't any posters and marketing going out. However, we all know the incredible value of any culture, which is all of them at this point, that have experienced any kind of trauma, right? So there is a sense of people that care about transformation and healing, of wanting to make sure that this work that a lot of us are involved in is accessible, right? Yeah, so that's it. So having said that, Paula, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you all hear me?
Yeah. So we're going to open up to questions in a bit, but I wanted to get both you and Izzy's just take on what I was just speaking about in terms of why is this conversation even important to be having?
Why this conversation?
You should hear it. That video's off.
why this conversation needs to what?
Oh, so why the conversation of inclusion, both with race and gender, is valuable? Like why we should be having it at all?
Oh, absolutely. I'd like to talk a little bit more about my experience in quote-unquote conscious spaces where people self-medicate for the sake of transformation. And something that I've noticed in my time is that, not only are these spaces not as diverse and accessible as they have the potential to be, as we have the capacity to conjure, but I would notice that it felt like people's transformative processes or awakening processes felt superficial or very performative. And I would notice that a lot of white folk and, folks of all races actually, appropriating cultural images and symbols and wearing them on the dance floor, just wearing them. And, as someone who was trained as an abolitionist at the age of 15 and was politicized at a very young age and has been doing community organizing and movement building work for just as much time as I've been self-medicating, it became really challenging to see how people were experiencing their own consciousness transforming, but then I wouldn't see them at the front lines, for organizing for prison abolition, for migrant justice, against war. And that's when I started to see wow, if you're really about liberation, if you're really about transformation, then why aren't you here protesting against state violence with me? Why am I doing disproportionate work to try to, speak out about state the presence, right? Because there is a lot to be struggling for. There's a lot to dismiss. Actually, now happening 4 years ago, and it just got worse because not enough people have been showing up. So I think what I would like to see is more people take accountability for the impact that war on drugs is having on people around the world. And that looks like fighting for people that are struggling right now in migrant concentration camps, and that means fighting for prison abolition and decriminalization.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, that really broadens the I'm not pointing it at them. I'm just going to move over. Is that better? Yeah. That really broadens our conversation. It reminds me of this idea that, let's say in the case of ayahuasca, you drink ayahuasca, you're having this amazing, deep, profound experience of communion with the planet itself, Pachamama, the cosmos. Yet some of those same people ignore the next petition about the Amazon being cut down, right? So there is this, what Miranda, a good friend of ours, refers to as a disconnect often with ceremony work or psychedelic, work as a tool for transformation, and that it really does become very kind of self-indulgent, right? If we can't find a way for that transformative experience to move beyond the personal self, right? And so I hadn't really thought about that until Paula, you were speaking, that the idea of inclusion and diversity really also speaks to that, that is the transformational experience we're having working with entheogens translating into how we're basically moving in the world outside of those experiences. So Izzy, the same question, and why is this conversation important at all to you, and you think in general?
Why is this important? Thank you, Paul, for saying that, and I really appreciate your framing of this question. I think I want to tie this back to something I referenced in that introduction around this collective shadow. One of the really interesting things that's happening right now, for sure in the United States, but I think it's happening around the world, there is a global kind of swing toward authoritarianism. Governments around the world, in Poland and Brazil and the United States, all over, are experiencing this radical shift toward mostly white supremacist, but really hyper-nationalistic, oppressive systems of government, even more so than they already are. And one of the ways that's getting articulated in the United States is this polarization, this divisiveness, this isolation, this extreme increase in awareness via social media, via cell phone videos, via all these different mediums of how we as a society have not really dealt with a lot of huge issues that have kind of been lingering under the surface. Now, I would say that people from marginalized communities would probably not say that they're under the surface, right? They're probably like, well, this stuff has been around all along. But for many people, white people, but also other affluent or privileged people, they're seeing this stuff kind of come up. And part of the reason I said earlier that I see it as an opportunity is because of that connection to this entheogenic experience. So the work that MAPS does focuses on is primarily psychedelic psychotherapy, psychedelic assisted therapy. And it's a little bit different from ceremony work in the sense that it's a substance that assists a generally Western psychotherapeutic method of talk therapy of dealing with trauma. And the way it works is by opening up channels, mental, that often prevent trauma from coming out, that often keep trauma buried under the surface, and that have all of these kind of auxiliary effects on people's lives. Repressed trauma and stress have all kinds of effects on people's lives. And part of the reason psychedelic therapy is so effective is because it opens up those channels and allows those things to be dealt with. So tying this all together, I think part of the reason it's so important to have this conversation right now is because we have done a lot of repression in our society. If our society was a person, we'd have all kinds of autoimmune stress responses. We'd be in bed sick all the time because we haven't actually dealt with a lot of these kind of inner things, these inner issues that have really plagued a lot of our society for a really long time. So when I think about questions about like diversity and inclusion, it is important to have representation. It's important that people of different cultures, of different spaces, of different from different parts of the conversation are involved. But for me, the core of that even is about access to healing. And I think that for me, if people who are in migrant camps, if people who are in prison, if people who are not just marginalized by their identity, but also further oppressed by the structures of society that marginalize them based on that identity, if those people are also able to access the healing I'm able to access as an educated, mixed race person living in the California Bay Area, then I know we've gotten somewhere. Right. So this whole conversation around diversity and inclusion and access for me includes all of these questions around economic access, social access, cultural access. And that means, again, not just representation, but it's like, how do we treat people who use substances that aren't psychedelics? How do we think about people who are kind of in all these different marginalized, intersecting identities? So the reason it's important, in addition to increased representation, and in addition to making sure that these systems of access, these systems of psychedelic and entheogenic healing are available, we have this tremendous opportunity in society to recognize that there are tools, some of which are psychedelic substances, but some of which are truth and accountability circles. They're restorative justice. They're circles. They're these different methods of accountability and of having difficult conversations through which we can discuss all of this stuff that a lot of people have really avoided discussing for a long time. So in the same way that, for example, like it took me years to realize what it meant to be, teased for the way I presented or the way I looked or the way I behaved, and to kind of articulate that and how that personal healing process for me has resulted in all kinds of openness. I think that us as a society dealing with, like Sita said, the stuff that a lot of people don't want to talk about, like what it means that our skin color is different, what it means that I'm getting treated differently, what it means that my name being Ismail Ali means that I get treated a certain way by TSA and have been since 9/11, basically. Like just understanding what that stuff means, it's only awkward at the beginning. It only is like hard because we're not used to it. I like to say that ignorance is bliss only for the ignorant. For everyone else, the ignorant is agony. Everyone else that's around the ignorant person is not having fun. They're like, wow, it must be really nice for you to not have to deal with this stuff. People who are more marginalized are like, wow, it's been really horrible to have everyone completely unaware of this conversation the whole time. So especially people who are uncomfortable, especially white people, especially privileged people, especially men, especially straight people, all of those people who have all these levels of privilege, this is a huge opportunity to become aware of these things that have been causing all kinds of harm and all kinds of agony to a lot of people for a really long time. And it's not about blame, it's not about shifting, but like Paula said, which I appreciate Paula always to bring this up, and I think it's so important, it's about accountability and awareness. Because once you have that accountability with the way that you look, society around you. So it's important because it gives us a chance to recreate those agreements and do them in ways that are actually in integrity.
Awesome.
Thank you both, Paula and Ismail. And to underscore, the awareness and accountability, and I think, what you both are speaking to is the results of multi-generational institutionalized trauma, right? So there's, when we talk about like what is the transpersonal part of this,
and intentional.
Yes, like, and to understand like this is where we've been, but also to understand that there are, mechanisms that continue to promote and entrench, institutionalized trauma. So just want to add that little piece in, and something that I'm curious about too. It's like I think, okay, so I've had years of personal transformation and healing, and then like when I'm at the grocery store, how do I talk to the checker, right? Like that's it. Like that's the healing, right? How do we take care of each other? Like, how are we really, our brother's keeper, our sister's keeper, and our supporter? Notwithstanding whether they're ever going to go to an ayahuasca ceremony. That's not important, right? So I know that for many of us, we could be tracked by this notion that it's about psychedelics and entheogens and ceremonial work. But the ceremony of life is with, the immigrant children who can't be touched, that are like imprisoned and taken from their families. Like, what are we doing about that? Like Paula said, like, how are we living in the ceremony of life? Like, how are we being intentional about the healing that we want to bring culturally, personally, transpersonally, and institutionally?
Wow. I was not expecting this conversation to be about accountability, and I'm glad it is. Yeah, as I was thinking about this morning, getting up and kind of like how to frame this for myself, because it's so broad, this conversation. The accountability is really such an important issue. I was thinking more about inclusion and how we do that as a community, but really a stronger piece is what's opening up here is because we are people that have access, what do we do with it, right? Relative to inclusion, and diversity. As you were speaking, David and I live in Atwater Village, and there's a white guy that lives in back. And we have this gardener that's been taking care of our apartment for 10 years, apparently. And a couple of weeks ago, we still don't know exactly why, but this guy in the back is always difficult, really challenging, doesn't participate in being a neighbor, in quotation marks, at all. So all we know is suddenly I hear all this screaming and yelling outside, and long story short, he apparently ran over the gardener because he was irritated that he was in his way. Literally ran over his legs, Mexican guy. And apparently did it twice, right? And then to make matters worse, he got out of the car and he yelled at him, basically. So regardless of the pathologies running with this guy, and clearly there are some, I talked to the owner the other day, and he said, well, look, here's the challenge, He immediately turned that entire story into the one that he thought he could get away with. Oh, that guy was trying to get into my apartment, and yeah, he made up this whole, David's hearing this for the first time, he made up this whole tale that this guy was plotting to get into his apartment and steal something. He would have done it 10 years ago. And of course, this is the usual way this plays out. The neighbor and his wife are very cautious about having this reported because it could bring trouble. Right? So even though they're here legally, still the idea is like, well, we don't want to cause any trouble. And you can't do much without their, consent. So, yeah, it just opens up. I hadn't really thought about this conversation of diversity and inclusion, which is really what it is. What kind of responsibilities do we have as a psychedelic and entheogenic plant medicine advocate community for diversity, and how we're moving the planet with that, So that's going to open up, let's give a comment, we're going to open up into hearing really what all you guys have to say. Again, these are not, suggestions are great. We're not necessarily looking for answers. Our goal with these meetings is just for us to actually be in conversation and community about things that, as Cedar brought up, we don't talk about normally. Maybe a couple of us do, but we don't as a community that is aware of this. And it is a beginning step towards actually kind of walking our talk. And as we like to say, doing the work between the work. How we take the ceremony experience, the psychedelic transformation experience, into how we're walking on the planet, basically. So under the umbrella of inclusion, diversity, gender, all of it, we're going to open up and basically have a dialogue. How do you want to do that in terms of the microphone?
Right.
Actually, can I say something else?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to go to Sita, and Izzy, always happy to hear from you.
And just to encourage people as you feel called to share, to also think like, what are the questions we need to be asking?
Yes.
Right? Like, so we're like, it's not like us, we're the experts up here because we have the mic and we're at the top of the room, but like, what are the questions that are relevant, and particularly what are the questions that people who are in the ceremony space as practitioners and facilitators, or in the organizational space as directors, or community organizers, like, what do we need to hear? What are the questions? So not just the answers, but the questions. Izzy?
Yeah, I appreciate the honesty, Tony, of like thinking it was going to go one way and acknowledging this like huge spaciousness. Like, I love it when we're like, this conversation is going to be really big, and then you end up realizing that it's even bigger than the bigness you thought it was. It's like a really wonderful thing. It's also kind of psychedelic, actually. But I just wanted to kind of connect those two things, because I actually think that this I can give a really concrete example, just that might help frame some of the questions as well, around like where those things are connected, where we're talking about these larger issues of trauma, refugees, racism, the legacy of slavery, all these huge issues, and then also kind of the more specific like diversity inclusion within psychedelics thing. Right. And I think that, so I'll just give an example because I think it might be a way to connect those. So as I mentioned earlier, I work for MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and we're about 3 years away from MDMA being approved for PTSD. MDMA-assisted psychotherapy being approved for PTSD. We're starting phase 3 FDA trials this summer, if all goes well and everything going according to plan. So far, so good. We're looking at about 3 years for approval. We have one major bottleneck at this point for access to MDMA psychotherapy, and that is therapists. The reality is, the number of people who have trauma, who experience trauma, and who are diagnosed with PTSD, many of whom are knowing full well that there are many people who are undiagnosed who also experience PTSD or have PTSD-like symptoms or various trauma responses, is astronomical. A lot of people have experienced trauma. I suspect a lot of people in this room have. It's not uncommon. It's all over the country, it's all over the world. So the number of people that may be able to benefit from something like psychedelic psychotherapy, or from an ayahuasca experience in an intentional setting, or from any of these other modalities, is humongous. There are a lot of people that may be able to benefit. With therapy in particular, it really makes a difference to have a therapist who understands where you're coming from. Something like 90-something% of the therapists who've been trained under MAPS programs so far are white. So if we keep going at this rate and continue to train the 300, 400, 1,000 therapists that we're going to need in 3 years for approval or into the future, then we'll have a whole bunch of really, really amazing therapists who come from mostly Caucasian white backgrounds and who may not be capable of serving all of the diversity of populations that actually experience trauma. Right. Now, I'm not necessarily super strict about this. My personal ancestral heritage is literally all over the world. Indigenous, South American, European, African, Asian, I'm all over the place. So if I believe that like only white people could help white people, only X person can help X person, then like I would be pretty messed up because there aren't that many people like me. So I really do believe that it's possible to train, to support, to educate people, to support people across the land. At the same time, having people who do have that experience, having Black therapists, having queer therapists, having therapists who've been to prison, having therapists that are in all these modalities, that have all these kind of different intersectional experiences, will ultimately make access to therapy significantly more effective.
Get the fingers.
So right now, we're really encouraging people who come from every single background possible, and especially for people who come from or work with marginalized populations, to get in the volume of people who need therapy and their identities, and the people who can offer therapy and their identities, then we're going to see a lot of re-traumatization, a lot of microaggression, a lot of issues within that therapy context, which is supposed to be safe, which may not be. So for MAPS, for example, the connection, how do we link these huge issues of social, cultural trauma to like inclusion within the industry, within this psychedelic conversation? I mean, if we don't have therapists that are diverse, that have all the experiences, then we're not going to have the access that we want, even if it's economically accessible, even if we somehow get a socialized healthcare system and everyone can get free psychedelic psychotherapy at some point, even if we like get all of the other economic social boundaries out of the way, that's a really, really major piece. So just to make the connection, like having facilitators, people who are working in that space, who are trained, who are educated, who care, who are willing to do the awkward, challenging internal work themselves on their own internalized trauma, oppression, etc., whether they're white or whatever else, is really important. So I just wanted to bring that because I think that like there is that connection, and it's usually through, maybe ironically, maybe not, that point of access into our own therapeutic and healing process.
So as we move into this period of the community discussion part, please keep your comments to a little bit shorter so we have space for everyone to speak. And also I want to kind of just take a pause before we all speak together, because a lot of times the people that are really the usual ones to speak up, and I'm definitely one of those people, are going to be the ones that like, oh, I'm ready to say something right now. If you're one of those people, pause. If you're one of the people that usually, has to kind of suss it out, and, is this a safe space for me to speak? I encourage you to step up, speak, and because I want to hear more of the voices of the people that we don't typically hear. And one piece of feedback that we got from our last conversation that I didn't notice at the time, but somebody said, well, a lot of the people that spoke and made comments in the dialogue around the issues around gender were all male. And I was like, oh, I didn't notice that. So how do we, I just want to maybe create this little pause moment right now so that we can give that breath to the people that have the quieter voices.
Yeah, and along with that, just a reminder, something we practice in our own community. Part of being in community discussion is learning how to be in it, right? And part of that is when you get the microphone, think about what you're going to say first, and then lay it out, concisely, and then hand the mic to someone else, right? Most of us don't realize once we get the microphone, it's like I've been waiting my whole life. And I'm going to share everything. Yeah, we want to be committed to this being actually a dialogue, not a platform for one person to either impress us or trying to teach everybody anything. So just be mindful that that's how we're contributing.
Or your whole life history.
Yeah, or your whole life history.
And you guys will keep the microphone, so you guys, if we want to say something, just project, please.
Yeah, so we'll just do like a show of hands. We'll just raise our hands to speak, and then so that Iz and Paula can hear, we'll repeat. Well, not if it's a comment, though, right?
Yeah, you don't need to.
Can they hear?
Repeat. I think they'll be able to hear.
Can you hear without the mic?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am?
Can you hear what's happening in the room?
All right, excellent.
So let's just maybe take a couple of breaths, and then whoever wants to speak, speak.
Well, I have a question. So as a therapist working in the South Central, South LA, Southeast LA area, how can we include more of the undocumented population? Because I work with a lot of undocumented people, and how are they going to be included in this as this becomes something that, let's just say, you know, MDMA or psilocybin become legalized? How can organizations like MAPS or Aware Project or other organizations that are sort of supporting this effort, how can they take those practical, concrete steps to actually including these people, these populations?
Question probably for Ismail. Did you understand that? Could you hear it?
Yeah, I did. That's a great question.
Yeah.
Okay, so two things. One, just kind of like an overview, kind of a larger framework. I'm committed to ending the war on drugs. A lot of the work that a lot of us in the drug policy movement, a lot of the work that we do in the drug policy movement is committing to end the war on drugs. But the reasoning behind that, like the reasoning behind the shifting of the framework, I think is a fundamental piece of answering your question. For undocumented people in the United States, admitting drug use is potentially and often a deportable offense.
Absolutely.
So people engaging with illegal drugs or drugs that are presently illegal, as I like to say, put themselves at much, much higher risk. And I think that the core of your in fact, I think a more homogenous, less diverse cast of characters in this world, because it's literally less safe for certain people to be involved with underground therapy, to experiment, to have the time, the space, the energy, to do whatever it takes to engage with these substances. So part of the underlying framework behind legalization or decriminalization, at least, is that people who ought to have access to these substances, including people who are undocumented, aren't criminalized further for their behavior. The idea being, if and when there are legal points of access, that alone, that seeking of healing, whether it's through smoking a joint or going to a rave and taking ecstasy or going to an ayahuasca ceremony, all of which are currently legal, all of which are technically drug use, and all of which can get you kicked out of the country if you're of a certain documented status or undocumented status. Part of the idea is that legal access, although there's a lot of problems with the law, there's a lot of problems with legal regulatory frameworks, is that you at least do what's possible to minimize the likelihood of that happening. To get to the second point, more specifically, what can we, MAPS, and these other organizations do to make these spaces more kind of available to undocumented folks and people who are of these like hypersensitive and hyper vulnerable populations? That's a really good question. I would say that with respect to undocumented folks in particular, the biggest thing that I believe would go a really long way, and this is especially true if you're working in the underground, and there are, for example, underground practitioners here who work with undocumented activists here in the Bay Area, and it's one of the joys of my heart is to see activists, people who do really powerful movement work, engaging with this medicine work. It's so beneficial for the community, for their healing, etc. Is that for a lot of people, for myself, for a lot of people in this room, we can talk openly about this, and we're putting ourselves at a certain kind of risk.
Right.
We're putting certain kinds of targets on ourselves, but those targets are mitigated, like for me, by my legal education, by my economic status, by like the things that I have in my life that allow me to minimize that risk. For people that are more vulnerable, that discretion becomes paramount, and there's a tension right now between the openness that we want to have for all people. We want people from marginalized communities to find this stuff. Like, I would love all of the people that I know that are engaged with movement work, who are marginalized, etc., to get involved. But they can't all be Michael Pollan. They can't all be like the person talking loudly in the room about that stuff. And I think that from an organization like MAP's perspective, where everything we do is above ground, it's totally legal, it's very much in the FDA, DEA kind of legal federal approval framework, our role is really to create the points of access in a legal way. And I think that for example, one of the things we're hoping to do to maybe bridge that is ideally, this is in process and something I'm really, really hoping, praying, and working for, is to create funds to pay for therapists to get trained that work with marginalized populations.
Yeah,
It'd be one thing to pay for therapy, that'd be great, and that might be at some point in the future accessible, and that might be possible. But ultimately, it's practitioners like, I didn't see you, but the person who asked that question, like you, who work with these populations to learn how to negotiate, not just like financially negotiate, I mean like kind of cosmically negotiate your agreements with how you're going to be giving your healing out to the world. And if that means that you're working with undocumented populations, and that's something that we're hoping to make accessible, then our job as MAPS is to make sure that there are as few barriers as possible to all people, and it's a slow process,
beautiful.
definitely ongoing, but it's like that process is happening, that unraveling is happening, and I, again, hope, pray, and work so in 3 years when MDMA therapy is legal, or in 5 years when psilocybin therapy is legal, legally approved, or 6 or however long it takes, that the status of the person getting the healing is not a factor. Of course, there are a lot of pieces in the way of that, and I'm not trying to be ignorant to the fact that that will continue to be an issue for a very long time. But I do think that particular issue of discretion and really listening to the fears and concerns of people that are in those populations, whether it's an undocumented person or a person from another marginalized population, listening, recognizing that we as people who have more privilege cannot understand the level of fear, the level of the navigation of the world in order to survive that a lot of other people have had to experience, and to honor that awareness and to work, negotiate, work in that healing space based on those points, instead of attempting to say we know better. Again, that didn't fully answer the question because there isn't a clear answer. It's definitely like what can be done. But I think the direction is to listen, to have discretion, and to really be aware of what people are working with and what's going to be coming up.
Thank you for that.
I'd like to add on to this
feedback.
if possible.
Go ahead, Paula.
Awesome. So to the person who asked this question, I've asked myself this question as well, and it's actually what led me down the path to initiate the organization Cosmovisiones Ancestrales. And it's particularly because I feel very called to work with mushroom medicine as well for treating post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I've also come to the realization that and the war on drugs and armed conflict, it means that we have to address the issue that many of the issues that indigenous communities face due to plunder, which is very overlapped with the reasons why they are forced to migrate. So I've come to learn that a lot of indigenous communities that have relationships with sacred medicine are also on the front lines of struggles to defend their land. And so my journey in trying to create a pathway for decriminalization and legalization is taking me to do transnational solidarity work to preserve the ancestral medicine that is also at risk because of extraction industries, because of paramilitaries that have a lot of overlap between drug trafficking, but also they're the same folks that are getting hired by place people so that they can take away their lands to extract resources. So there's this really wild intersection with the war on drugs and the extractive industries and the migrant crisis that we're witnessing right now. So many of the folks that are forced to migrate are migrating because they're being, they're experiencing being bombarded by U.S. military aid in their lands and the proliferation of arms that is facilitated by our gun. And it's really heavy stuff, folks. accountability as U.S. taxpayers. We really need to show up for the undocumented organizers that organize events to resist the policies that are impacting folks. Yeah, I mean, that's a lot. It's a lot, but for me, it's not risky. There's a lot of nothing right now. It's in danger because of climate change. So right now I'm in Huautla, Oaxaca, and some of the mushrooms are endangered because there's less rainfall, and so the mushroom growth thrives with rainfall. And I know that there's endangerment of peyote in Texas and northern Mexico, in the state of San Luis Potosí and Wirikuta. So something for me that is important to make the medicine accessible to populations that are hyper marginalized by state violence is to also focus on conservation and to ask ourselves why these plant medicines are at risk. And it has a lot to do with where our taxpayer money is going. It has a lot to do with unsustainable consumption practices that are happening within our community. And so bringing up these counter narratives so that people are not consuming the medicine in an unsustainable way, in an unrelated way to the folks who are paying the consequences. A lot of indigenous folks in different communities are devastated when they are not seeing the same population numbers of mushrooms sprout in certain seasons, or the same amounts of peyote buds grow. So it's devastating to witness. So for me, it's giving voice to those intersections.
Thank you, both of you, for those correlations, and to the person, to the man here who asked that question. I'm going to speak just very quickly, like more locally, because I've thought about this too. How do we get the word out? It's like, okay, so there's a poster, some information. You know, at a grassroots level, you take that stack of flyers and you go to a neighborhood where maybe somebody isn't otherwise going to hear about it, and like say, here's some education. Like we just, you know, the Los Angeles, you know, psychedelic symposium just happened, right? Like, I don't know, you know, that information went to a certain segment of the population. Well, maybe that information, you know, can go out to a neighborhood where that maybe poster wouldn't otherwise be, and one person shows up to the conference.
Right.
You know, like, and so it's really like, at the level of like, but then what do we do with all of this awareness? Like feet on the ground, you know, and we get in our car and we drive, or, you know, we get on the bus or whatever we do. So there's that, and then, you know, this scholarship fund idea to train practitioners and therapists that otherwise wouldn't have access to the training. And I'm, you know, involved in a global steering committee for that, for some other trauma therapy. Like, how do we reach the people who wouldn't get, like, they can't even afford to be trained to do this kind of work in the first place, and mentorship in that. So I think that that's, you know, also part of that. And I know that there's been some conversations with MAPS and the Beckley Foundation around these things. So that's it, like getting the people trained to do the work in the marginalized, disenfranchised, and, you know, other communities.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. Thank you. That opened up a beautiful conversation. Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, and kind of to what Sita was saying and what Paula said earlier, and this is just a thought, I wonder if there's some opportunity for the psychedelic community to kind of form alliances with some of these more social justice related groups that kind of are on the front lines of these issues, and that could kind of help build awareness in certain communities as well. And I don't know what that would look like logistically, but just a thought that came off what you were saying.
Yeah, it's interesting. Everything, what you just said too, just what Ishmael brought up to me answers, you know, the short answer to your question is someone in your organization or that is related to it needs to be trained. That's what's going to come down to, right? Yeah, because it's very dicey in the current climate to kind of build these alliances, you know, understandably. And as Ismail pointed out, you know, certain segments of our population, marginalized groups, have a lot more to lose, even by being in association, than others, and they know it, you know. So I think, yeah, kind of going back to your question, you know, it's probably reaching out to, at this stage, what is very practical to me would be finding these organizations and saying, are you aware that this training is going on for endemic studies? You know, you should contact MAPS, because if someone in your facility or your organization got this training, in 3 years' time, you could bring it to your population. That would be really practical. Yeah. Cool. So
I've been going to like meetups for therapists that work with marginalized populations, and it's actually really wonderful. And if people in that group, in this crowd, are already therapists or interested, people are really interested. Like, the conversations are actually really easy to have. It's exactly what you said, Tony. It's like a combination of what you've all said. It's like the way you build those alliances is by showing up and then not talking about psychedelics and just listening to people. And like, what's going on? Like, how do we show up in solidarity with X, Y, or Z thing? And the reality is that the thing about this whole conversation on healing that's, I think, so interesting is that what people hear and what people see is, especially people from outside of and they think psychedelic, like the thing that makes people see things and all that stuff. When we talk about it at MAPS, we talk about psychedelics. Y'all are talking about psychedelics, but a lot of this conversation is really about trauma. And that's something that everyone is familiar with. Everyone gets trauma and what its impact is. So that conversation is going to come up. I think it's very easy to be an evangelist for psychedelics, to like show up on those spaces and be like, y'all need to know about this. And if you're going to a space where it's a bunch of therapists who are talking about trauma, then then you go like, by the way, have you heard of MDMA therapy? Have you heard of these other substances? Have you heard about ayahuasca and this research? Have you heard about this stuff? But if you're just beginning the process of creating those points of access, those points of community, then you just show up and listen. Like, you just show up, like Paula said, like on the front lines or wherever it is that you want to show up, like whether it's to a protest, whether it's to a community group meeting, something that's local, something that's super relevant to you and your people that you actually care about, that is actually relevant to you and your community. And then from there, like, the conversation will develop. That's the wonderful thing about psychedelics, is that psychedelics and trauma are kind of relevant to every subject in the entire world. There's always a way to talk about them. You just have to kind of let that kind of occur organically instead of being the person who's always bringing it up, because that can be really grating.
Beautiful, thank you. So we want to shift the dynamic here a little bit, because we only got 30 minutes-ish left. We really want to now have you guys kind of basically talking to each other, right? Meaning, like, we're just going to have a conversation and less addressing questions. We're going to try to refrain from commenting, because we really want to hear, that's the whole point of what you guys have to say about this. Unless there's a specific question for one of us to answer, the idea really is to be in dialogue, right? And this has been really, really informative, but we don't want to miss the opportunity from just having community dialogue. Don't be shy. Yes. Says the colonel was right,
when I begin to think about one of the ways that we could be supporting really, really marginalized groups, something that's been a passion of mine, Ishmael as well, when I was in college as well, finding out about the SSDP, the Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And at the time I was discovering, that so much more money is spent on prisoners than on students. Like, I had all this debt, and then I was pissed when I found out that, of course, there's things like ayahuasca happening for prisoners in Brazil, but it's not, becoming, a huge movement yet. But if the public were to take a vote and vote on, it would really have to take a completely different relationship to how we consider how to help people to heal. Punishing people and putting them in prison, this is a social justice issue for sure. But if plant medicines were able to be acknowledged for their therapeutic and healing aspects, and given to the people who are really just the phrase hurt people, it's from a really compassionate place, if we as a community were able to be that way, having plant medicines available for populations, maybe as opposed to rehab clinics that are already just obviously not working. If anyone has friends who have gone into those weird things, but if someone's rehab included plant medicine work, and you get where I'm going with this. This would be a really amazing way that we could institutionalize a huge step in the right direction of this conversation of making it more accessible and available, like same access. I forget the word you used.
Yeah. Well, what you're saying is so relevant and kind of tying into what Izzy's saying. Making this really concise. It's true. If you were to do something like that, once, let's say, MDMA, mushrooms, and over are legalized, take them into prison populations, needless to say, you're automatically hitting marginalized people, people of color. That's actually a beautiful place to start. Yeah. So that's a really good point, actually. Anyone?
For everyone. I find myself kind of struck oftentimes by how much, in addition to the power and the beauty and all this of the community around entheogenic work, how much money there is and how much we as a community, myself, how much we end up contributing towards this work. And I wonder how some of that can be applied. I mean, of course it is, many of these practices are pretty costly, and we want to support the lives and the work of those involved, but also, I mean, just like as, for example, maybe if there was an option in some ceremonial contexts or other events where you could opt in to pitch $5 or $10 towards a scholarship for a person of lower socioeconomic standing, a person of color. I mean, who would say no, $5 or $10? And if you got 40 people, that's 2 scholarships right there. Like, I wonder, or in the integration, if there could be a small conversation had around how to translate some of this personal work into a broader impact without proselytizing. I don't know. I wonder how some of that could be incorporated, since there is so much money, and with the love behind it, like how that could be applied.
We could have another dialogue asked about ceremony, I don't know, healing work meets capitalism. I don't know what we want to call that. Izzy's nodding.
Hard yes.
Yeah. And which would automatically overlap into accessibility and bring us right back to this conversation. So we'll avoid that tonight because I have a lot to say. But I would like to, if anyone wants to respond to that or bring anything else up related, that would be great. That's a really big topic, and I think we really will make that one of our subjects. Yeah. Accessibility is at the very core of what we're talking about, and finance is a big deal.
That will lead to diversity.
Yeah, it will lead us right back to diversity. And
yeah, and I think it also leads us back to integration and leads us back to accountability, which are 2 things that I've heard in all of the events I've gone to for, like, whether it's psychedelic symposium or plant teachers. Those are 2 big things that we don't have structure because we are an underground community. So we don't have, like, I'm a high school teacher in South Central. To be in charge of 30 kids and their math, I need to go through a certain process. But I find that in this community, there is more freedom, I should say, even if you're dealing with people's psyches, or if you're, going to larger groups and going into really like complex settings and spaces. So a few things that I kind of took down as just big questions that I have around this is, I think that, and it's a natural part of the psychedelic process, I think, is to be like, everyone should do this, right? But maybe that can also be a mirror looking inwards of not how can everybody else have this experience, but how can I take this experience to everybody else without needing them to be in the same exact space that I'm in. So, like, how can I take my teachings that I have and share, like Sito was saying, that whether it's love or compassion or inclusivity or oneness or unity, whatever it is, with people that maybe are not at this stage for whatever reason that they won't have that psychedelic experience necessarily. So bringing that work outwards, and even encouraging. I don't think everybody's an activist. I think that's okay. I think everybody has different roles in the world. People are going to be on the front lines. People are going to be doing other kinds of work. But I think everybody can be aware, and everybody can be part of listening and giving voice to people that might not otherwise be represented, and just being aware of that, even if you're not as badass as like Paula. That's so cool.
Paula, you're badass.
Yeah. So I think that in general, it's like there's a big question of how can we take the practices that we have and apply them for other people. I think there's a question of how do both privileged people and underrepresented people hold facilitators and circles accountable for the times when people do feel othered and or ignored and or underrepresented, which I feel frequently when I'm in spaces like this as like a queer brown woman. And I think a few other questions too is like what's our responsibility in making sure that the access is not limited to privileged people, because I think there's a lot of really tangible practice, like Emily was saying, that can allow us to show up in that way. And whether that's like whether that's making the effort to meet, even like be friends in our day-to-day lives with other people and just sharing, again, you don't have to share like, you must come to ceremony, but it could be sharing some of the teachings and takeaways. I find that doing that with my students has been really effective, even if I'm not talking about entheogenics at all.
Right.
There's a certain element of the teachings that I have in my daily conversation with them that they absolutely feel and they reflect back to me in a very powerful way. And I think it's possible for all of us in our own paths, whatever that may be.
That's great. Good point.
And just to say too that there may be people who are undocumented and want to be on the front lines, and want to take that step, and to not say, oh, but you're a high risk population, but like if somebody wants to like stand up and fight, because I know sometimes like we can run the risk of like being patronizing, and so like also be mindful of that as well.
So I want to acknowledge that there's been a lot of talk of marginalized groups, and I'm very aware of that. I've been sitting in this work for the last 7 years, and something I was thinking about it. Tony was talking about advertising in posters and making sure, like if you don't see your own people, I just need to put my plug in there because as an Asian female, because I know the people in the video can't see me, like I can't help but be aware that there's only one other Asian person here, and that like only in the like when I go to a ceremony and I notice another Asian person, I feel shocked. Like I'm like, how did you get here? I literally went up there. How did I get here? Like, I always ask them, So it's like I feel like that's also within the race. I mean, I don't think that Asians are maybe included in the marginalized. I mean, there probably are some, I don't know them, but. So I feel like that really it becomes like a race thing, because it's like, like you're saying, it's like we're all one. I open my eyes and everyone is white, like almost everyone is white. So I just find that to be like for me, that's been my experience. That like, I mean, I'm hyper aware also, just like like the marginalized, the undocumented brown people, and I'm a yellow person, So it's just. I want to speak up for the stereotypical silent Asians. Like you hear about it all the time. Like Asians, they're just kind of like over there and they get screwed a little, but no one ever says anything about it. So I kind of wanted to bring that up too, because as an Asian person, I notice there's not any Asian people either, and I'm like, how do I help bring Asian people?
You just nailed it really quickly. You nailed it. It's really about you being visible is enough. Right. The reason why I decided to be a public advocate was because I realized Black people need to see a Black man talking about this medicine in a positive way, period. And it's made a huge difference already. So you just showing up is like a big deal.
Yeah.
Actually, I would like to say something about that recruiting session, because that's a really valid point, like the levels of invisibilized people even within invisibilized people. It's like, it's complicated, it's like really challenging. And I'll say two things. One, there are increasing efforts to get Asian Americans involved in the drug policy conversation here in the Bay Area, and I don't know like what kind of country your ancestry is from, person who spoke, but if you'd like to like get plugged into that, I'd be very happy to plug into that, because there is, especially in California, there's a humongous population of people from East Asia. I'm personally Indian myself, or partially Indian myself, but I'm assuming you were talking about people from like mostly East Asia, and I think that there are different populations who've had different kind of levels of access to certain kinds of power in the United States, and this is particularly true on the West Coast of a lot of Asian people. And that has led to kind of a schism or a break in how some of those populations talk about drug policy and thus drugs. And I do a lot of drug education, and like the first thing I talk about is how literally the San Francisco ban on opium was literally this racist policy against Chinese Americans coming in the late 1800s, and how that conversation gets really undermined, or not undermined, but actually it gets kind of pushed down in favor of the criminalization of marijuana in the 20s and 30s, and the war on drugs, which primarily targeted Latino and Black people. But I think that it's really, I'm glad that you said what you said, and I also want to put in a plug, I guess, for I've been working with a community that is people who are from any people who self-identify that way, and not all Asian people identify that way, but I do think that acknowledging how even within marginalized groups there are those nuances can go a really long way. So I'm really glad you said what you said. I think it's a very valid point, and I think that I hope it's clear that when I'm talking about marginalized people, I'm definitely I'm trying to go to what Tony was saying earlier. We're going past the color, past the skin, while also acknowledging the fact that the skin and all that is very real. And I think part of that is acknowledging the levels of invisibilizing that happens even within words phrases like POC, even phrases like marginalized people, even phrases about how we use that language. So yeah.
Thank you.
Big time.
So mine would be my question is more or less groups of psychedelic kind of awareness groups, and so as a teenager I was put on Adderall and Vyvanse and Ritalin as a young boy, 14 years old, and as my brain grew and as a teenager, as I was developing, I was taking it daily, every morning. And so when my health insurance went up, when I moved to different states, I had to discontinue the medication, and obviously went through severe withdrawals, severe contemplation of life itself, and I found the only thing that ever helped me was psychedelic medication, and Bufo, various combo, antidepressants, psilocybin. So what would be as kind of a voice to maybe fight against, the marketing of maybe methamphetamine salts, any sort of kind of upper, amongst the children, because I still, to this day have some sort of, memory, things like that, and I've within myself, I've always kind of wanted to reach out, but I'm not sure because of, such the underground sort of medical, rejuvenation that I've received from these ancient medicines. What would be some groups, I guess, that I could maybe contact that could give my voice, maybe a louder voice? So that's kind of the question.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing also is okay, teenagers maybe an unheard voice. It's part of this group.
Yeah, so as a fellow white privileged male, I don't identify with that, and because of my past, I have other identifications, right? The former drug addict, and former whatever. So knowing that, I think you just have to make a stand and say, okay, this is my new identity, right? And that's what, in the work that we do, we're reframing our identities with the psychedelic work.
Absolutely.
And so I see that you have to really make a stand and say, this is what I'm about, and this is what I do. And even though people see me, and we're maybe walking down the street, they see this white male, that's not who I am, and that's not who, when people meet me, that's not who they really encounter. So, I think it's just really making a stand and speaking to that, and being serious about it.
And I think that there's also an acknowledgement that you also, that may not be the way that you identify yourself, but at the same time you have the privilege to not think that way, whereas a lot of people that, just by looking at, them, you have all this stuff that goes along with it, so.
Yeah, I move in the world as a privileged white male, face it, being black. Meaning, I'm educated, I have access to a lot of resources, I can travel. you know, and being an artist and entertainer, I have a lot of kind of like privilege when I travel. And when we were in Thailand recently, I was very aware that while I'm moving through the planet in a lot of ways, the way that historically white privileged males weren't able to move. So it's actually about access and Ishmael used the word earlier, I can't remember what it was. It's referring, I think, to an archetype in a sense at this point, the privileged white male. We're really looking at people with privilege who have access and resources. Yeah. Yeah, because I think in the past what that has referred to actually refers to a whole segment of the population now. Probably every man in this room for the most part. Yeah, so both of you made really good points. It's like, are you the privileged white male that we're archetypically speaking about? No. To the rest of the world, you are absolutely a privileged white male. The world was designed for you to move in. Okay? It's just a lot of people of color, me included, have gotten clever enough to figure out how to move in that same world and take advantage. And I'm the first to admit it, you know. Yeah. One of the things my parents did, really important, and they were very clear about it, was you need to learn to speak the colonizer's language because that will be your access to the world. And they were absolutely right. You know. Anyone else?
I think one more thing to differentiate here, which is really helpful for me when having these conversations, is especially when talking about race, is acknowledging the difference between white people and whiteness.
Absolutely.
And acknowledging that whiteness as a structure, something that people of any, like, that anyone can opt into, recognizing that whiteness is not just about skin color. It is attached to people who are kind of complicity in whiteness that that has a kind of a spectrum. Yeah. So like those not identifying with like the identity with like what you look like, which, as Tony said, you know, like you can think whatever you want, but that's how people are going to treat you, and that's how you're going to walk around the world. But then also recognizing that there are ways to divest from whiteness and divest from the way that you benefit from that in a way that actually creates space for other people to benefit. And I think that there are, when talking about like how to balance that, a lot of it has to do with acknowledging and sharing historical burdens, which can be done in a lot of different ways and can be really creative.
When you said that, they applauded in the next room. Perfect. Thank you for that. How much time do we have?
We have about 10 minutes,
Great.
And so I also wanted maybe to focus the conversation a little bit around like what can we do on a really like hyper-local space, because we've gotten to such big, I mean, it's such an enormous conversation, but we're, you know, how many people in this room representing our different fields, our different organizations, whatever we do on a day-to-day basis, what are ways that we can contribute to this space on a local level and to be able to, you know, move to, you know, to make some lasting change, and also what kinds of other spaces after this one that we have here today, what other conversation spaces and themes can we have for further events?
And I'm going to challenge us to zip it as the panelists.
So one thing that I noticed is, especially with Black people, there is a general sense of trust that Black people need to feel when they're entering a circle. And just because you're the only Black person in a circle that's predominantly white, it can be very off-putting. And coming back and reintegrating into some of that sometimes can really freak you out. Even though I grew up predominantly with white people and I'm okay with friends, but a bunch of strangers is kind of a little freaky. So it's, I guess one of the things I would think about is just how could you introduce psychedelics to Black people in a way that actually allows them to feel comfortable. So I don't know if that would be evolving like an all-Black circle, having a Black provider with an all-Black circle, just something so that you can actually introduce it to a group of people in a setting where they actually feel comfortable.
It's fantastic because we hold women's circles, men's circles, LGBT circles. I mean, where is there an opportunity for us to actually just specifically say, I mean, if it's just a women's circle, it's basically us saying we just want to be with our own this weekend. So.
I just want to say a group that I sit with,
first time I went, it was the first time I ever sat. It was like mostly Asian people. Like only, almost, I mean, there was maybe a few other white people there. And at first I was like, that's really interesting. Like, are the Asian people really into Aya or something? But just to the point, like what you just mentioned and you mentioned, I think, and then it sort of occurred to me that I didn't really think about before, but the main guy who brought me in, the promoter, I guess, like he, beautiful man, but he was Asian, you know, and he's, I think part of being that is he organized it, and then the teacher was also Asian from Taiwan, and it was never discussed or anything like that, and everybody there was beautiful and super great. But I think, yeah, having people who are more the organizers, or then immediately all these other people, and a lot of the other Asian people there, that's the first time they'd sat, they'd never even taken other psychedelics or anything. They weren't like necessarily super alternative people. And I think just having those people in those spaces to bring others in that, hey, look, you're doing this and I'm doing this. And, yeah, I think it was super beneficial.
I just want to say I'm Asian. I love this conversation. I love that it's bringing up the point that I've been ruminating on. Is this something to think about to start groups, specifically Asian women or Asian? Do we do outreach? Do we do these things? Do we do it without segregating, seeming like that? How do we do it in a way that, you know, that we're not trying, this is all one, but yet I can tell you, coming from a poor, uneducated, my parents, Vietnam War, they didn't even finish elementary. I was one of the first to go to college. Getting a bachelor's was a big deal. But poor, uneducated, I can tell you, coming from that, so much of the poor, uneducated Asian in Southeast Asia, there's a lot of common roots. And I kind of had this conversation with you a little, Toya, earlier. It's like this Asian guilt, codependency in Asian, and that it's like on another level. There's a lot of core thing, tiger parenting. You know, these are things that are really valid, and I know when to just be around another one, just to, oh yeah, I know, my mom, yeah, my dad. You know, do we create space so that someone can just hold that space? It's so comforting. It's so nice. I'm a hypnotherapist. I have a practice. I see clients, and sometimes I get these clients, and just to have someone to say, yeah, I get it. You know, do we try to create spaces like this? Something to think about. That's something we can do on a local level.
Beautiful.
Yeah, something to think about maybe.
I think another extension that we could have with this conversation is not just how minorities relate to white people, but how we relate to each other. Because I personally grew up in a lot of diverse communities, and honestly, most of the racism I faced was through other minorities. So I feel like that does not get talked about at all. And we kind of identify ourselves as minorities through the way we relate to white people, and through that medium, at the same time, I feel like in some weird way, that's what brought us together through this level of tolerance as well. So, interesting dynamic there.
Thank you. The two of you.
Yeah, so one thing, just a practical thing that we can all do on a local level, I think, is to just learn more about history. Because I think it's good to just remember that this is all grounded in a historical context, and there's nothing about being white, the color specifically, that's bad or anything. It's because there's a long history of white people dominating other people. And so I think, you know, just the more we educate ourselves about different instances of that, and the more we just have a full understanding of where that's coming from, the more grounded our approaches to change and just our understanding is going to be. Yeah.
You good?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I just returned from a meditation retreat, predominantly Asian people, so I'm a white person speaking. There were predominantly Asian, I was a minority, however, I wasn't the only white person. I did know, and I'm responding actually to your comments, sir. There was one black person, he was the only one there. And I noticed that he was actually staying outside of the meditation room. it was actually staying in the backyard during many of the sessions. And my question actually to you is what, you know, and I appreciate what you shared, that there's if somebody who's black comes into an environment or a group and they're the only one who's black, like there's a certain level of trust that's not there, and that needs to be cultivated. So what have you found, or what can you share with us that's helpful to help engender that? I mean, what I think is, you know, just on a simple level, a sense of friendliness. What have you found, or what can you share with us that would be helpful to create that trust with people, either black or anyone who happens to be a minority in a group?
I mean, honestly, like, friendly eye contact. Like, a lot of the times when I'm walking down the street, you see someone and they'll divert their eyes right away, or they'll grab their purse, or they'll cross the street. So, you know, these are the little things that, as a black person, I see all the time. So it's like, you know, you become very wary of people. So it's like, how do you learn to trust people again? That's really what it comes down to. So, like, I'll look up and I'll try and make eye contact with people. Sometimes they'll just divert their eyes right away or ignore me, and I'm like, oh, they're probably doing it because they're black, and discount the fact, oh, maybe they're having a bad day, or maybe they just don't feel like talking, or whatever it is. But because I have that whole idea of being black and that being a reason why no one wants to talk to me, then that just gets reinforced. So a lot of times with black people, that's what's going on, I think. Or at least that's what's going on with me.
So we are closing in on time. And so as far as, I mean, so it's one of the things that I'm kind of gleaning from this as a event producer of Gateware Project.
We need part two.
Yeah, it is that, you know, there's clearly not enough time, but I'm also wondering, you know, if there would be a value in creating a space that there are no white people, that is having this same conversation, but there are no white people. And then being able to kind of, you know, because we're taking notes off of all of these, and I don't know, you know, we'll see how this all evolves, but I mean, if there's a desire for ceremony space, it sounds like that might be of value as well.
I remember.
We only have time for one more comment, so it's going to be yours. But we can, you know, we'll linger after.
Yeah.
I just want to touch on the element of listening. I remember I was in a ceremony once, and there was a segment where the men sat and the women talked, and the men just listened, and that was kind of a novelty. And I think that in terms of a conversation, it could be powerful for people of color to speak, and then for people not to only be present, but just to listen, because I think that there's so much to learn. But I don't necessarily think that's exclusive from one another, that we have to separate ourselves. It's really powerful when we can hear each other and just take it in.
Yeah, so what we're going to do now is we're going to have a closing statement from each of the panelists. So, Paula, we can't see you, but I'm hoping, assuming you're still with us. I'm just going to... Oh, great.
In just a few minutes.
Yeah, and it's just a couple of minutes so that we can, you know, get your closing thoughts on the conversation. I'll just start to be really brief, and what I got from this is that this is a huge conversation, and it ends up being a conversation actually about race and diversity. And you can see how complicated it is to try to, as Ashley asked for, bring that conversation into what we can actually do relative to the topic, which is psychedelic and entheogenic work. But it's such a huge conversation, we probably need to have this same topic part two. So that's it for me. I learned a lot tonight, actually. Way more than I thought about, as I said this morning when I woke up.
Thank you, everybody, and I would have to agree with that in terms of learning so much. And I think my closing statement is on in a conversation around race and diversity. I am just really grateful and feel very privileged to be part of that conversation as a white woman in this room. So, you know, thank you, and thank you all for, you know, your honest contributions about what's going on for you. So yeah, thank you.
Isabel?
King.
Hello. Oh, we can't hear you. AI.
Oh.
Let's go to Ismail and then see if we can go back to you, Paula.
Okay. Dang, I saw Paula and you like right before. Okay. This was a great.
We can't hear you at all, Paula.
This was a really good conversation. I'm really glad to have been a part of it. I totally agree with what Tony and Cede have said, but I guess to close, I'll just say a couple things. I heard one of the comments, someone used the phrase hurt people. And in law school, one of the things I studied was restorative justice, and like the whole phrase that is in there is that hurt people, but then healed people heal people. Mm-hmm. And I think my closing, I want to just like talk about this idea of healing. There is this idea in the harm reduction community that harm reduction is reducing the harms for people who use drugs. And there's been this term kind of suggested by some harm reduction into what they call full spectrum harm reduction. The harm reduction not just for the people who are injecting drugs, for the people who are at risk of death, at risk of overdose, at risk of whatever, but also when you think of full spectrum harm reduction is harm reduction for the people who are using drugs and the impacts of the drug policies. So harm reduction for the global south, which includes a lot of what Paulo was talking about earlier, which is awareness of how our drug consumption, our experience, our taxes impacts the rest of the world. And harm reduction is not just like harm reduction on the individual level, but it's harm reduction on this global level, including awareness of all these of all these levels. So I wanted to bring that up to analogize it to what I would call full spectrum healing. If healed people heal people, the healed people are not the people who are just healing themselves in their own experience, or even healing just themselves and their ancestry in both directions, as we do. It's also acknowledging that the process of healing cannot be done outside of that social, political, cultural context. So I think in closing, this idea about healing, about personal healing, about personal growth, about healed people, the process that a lot of us are on, healing other people, not to be used as like a way to bypass, like, well, I'm doing my healing, so clearly I'm healing other people. It's not that simple. And acknowledging that in order to do your own healing, even if you're the most privileged, richest, whitest person, whatever that is, that healing process must be done in community and in solidarity with the healing of other people. So I think that when we're thinking about a process of our own healing, our own growth, our own like unraveling of our own kind of like, pulling out like the darkness, the shadow of our own experience, so we can not pass that on to our children, our children's children, or whoever. To think about full spectrum healing and the fact that we really will and does benefit even the most privileged among us, and from the most privileged among us to the most marginalized. And just thinking about full spectrum healing as this like larger framework for what healing is, and recognizing that the healing that we're doing for the earth, for these marginalized people, for others, is really healing that we're doing in solidarity with our own experience and with our own growth. Super grateful to be part of this conversation. I'm looking forward to part 2.
Yeah, me too.
Hi everyone, can you hear me now?
Yes, you're back.
Awesome. So I'm really blessed to be a part of this conversation. Ismail really verbalized everything that I'm thinking and feeling, and I just want to share with folks that when I self-medicate, I see it as a commitment. I see it as a commitment to other folks who are impacted by state violence, and I just want to make sure that when folks consume medicine, they do it in a way that isn't at the expense of other people, at the expense of other communities in the global south, and at the expense of folks who are criminalized and incarcerated for the current policy. I'm gonna emphasize folks that I find it problematic to romanticize people, and I would really love to see more people show up, because we really have a lot of timely questions, like questions of our generation. Like, are we going to get rid of migrant concentration camps in our lifetime? Are we going to withdraw our taxpayer money from funding war all over the world? Like, these are pressing questions that
Oh, lost her again. Oh, let her finish.
Paula, we're losing your connection again.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we got most of what you said, Paula. Unfortunately, we can't hear the rest, but you added so much to this conversation. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really, really beautiful. Izzy, really good to see you again. Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. As always, a pleasure. And Ash, do you want to close?
Yeah. Okay. This is
now on. Thank you all so much for coming to this. It's, being able to share this space with each other and to acknowledge things that are those uncomfortable conversations and start getting practice talking about these things. It's very exciting. So I'm looking forward to more discussions and please continue the conversation. We have a Facebook community group. So please, or on the Facebook event, put your comments. If you have ideas for further events or anything like that, or want to get involved in creating these spaces, we can always use more help here at the Aware Project. So you can email us at hello@awareproject.org. Would love to hear from you. I'd like to thank the Thymel Arts Center for hosting us this evening. This is a new event space for us, so thank you to them. Thank you to the I'm Life Tea House for nourishing us with our delicious tea. And thank you so much to the panelists. This has been really good. And thank you, Paula, for inviting Ishmael, because we were kind of like, who else should be on the panel? And then you were the first person that we that she suggested. So happy to have you.
To echo what Cesar said, and I've heard around the room, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be a part of this conversation as well, and thanks so much to particularly folks of color and LGBTQIA folks for allowing for the trust and allowing for folks like me to be here. So very grateful. Thank you. I'm just going to play a couple of songs here that I hope will speak to some of the messages that were so beautifully shared tonight.
This evening can't do it without you.
The first of which is a song about trying to shift our relationship with the more challenging aspects in our lives and regard them as teachers. Learning to embrace the ebb and flow. the mind's eye tends to worry when the sun sets down each night. But his fire tears through treetops, burning each down to the bone. After that tragedy, our sacred earth still remembers how to grow. Letting go. Letting go. Strip the layers so the spirit shows. Thank you so much. Sing what you sing.
I don't know, but yeah. Okay, let's see. Sure. I'll just turn this. What do you think? I think if you hold it a bit away so the volume's more. Hello. Hello. Hello.
Do you want this projector off? Is it hitting your eyes? Okay.
Thanks for asking.
I tell you all my secrets, but you already know about the whole and all its pieces. I'm a sea without a shore. Every story has a moral, the marrow and the bone, and every path leads to a portal where the code is etched in stone. Eye to eye and hand to heart to soul. To be alive means never to be alone. We're not alone. We're matter reassembled from millions of stars, and through time and space and splendor arrived at where we are, both complex and simple, the whole and just a part. As we grow we will remember how we got this far. Eye to eye and hand to heart to soul. To be alive means never to be alone. We're not alone. Though at times it seems that all we're on is lonely. That each stranger on the street goes through the same thing. The trip of being in a body, and that body flying through space among the billions of others, all different but the same, can freak you out. But with a deep breath, our shared atmosphere whispers to our stardust bodies, you have nothing to fear. Eye to eye and hand to heart to soul. I know we've been sitting for a while, so I'll keep it pretty quick. Like 1.5 more, is that cool? I'm gonna try to. So this next one I'd like to share is a new one, but it's inspired by, well, you know, maybe I'm not alone in this, but no pun intended. But this year and in the years preceding this, I've felt possibly more enraged than ever at the use of power, the abuse of power by so many in this country in particular. And at the same time, I've also been looking for a way to reframe that more constructively, and I've never felt so inspired by seeing grassroots movements that try and change the world for the positive. So that's what this song's about. What can we do with that anger?
Out in a distant clearing, quiet, you can hear her breathing, feel her heart beating like a drum. There is a world awaiting, home of peace and reparations. Maybe it's not that far from home. Come on, we're getting closer. Come on, we're getting closer. When I close my eyes, I hear the voices crying. Hurry, we don't have much time. No, I'm not for the healing family. I'm for us, it's needed to speak up and to listen, to act on intention. Hey, we got work to do now. Must not dismiss the vision. What's achieved by cynicism? Justice needs the hand and the heart. Better walk the walk of our religion. Put our money where our mouth is. Right now is the right time to start. Come on, we're getting closer. Come on, we're getting closer. So my first allegiance is to our people, to our equal. Nobody's free, no. Hold on for the healing family. I'm for us, it's needed to speak up and to listen, to act on intention. Hey, we got work to do now. The veil is getting thinner. We're staring, we're in the face. The time and the place is right where we are standing before it. Miles away, miles away. Now it's easy to get disillusioned way down by the mountain pollution, custom tailored headlines and hate. We're hardwired for evolution if we envision a future inclusive of all we can make. Yeah. Come on, we're getting closer. Come on, we're getting closer. Come on, we're getting, come on, we're getting. Hold on for the healing family. I'm for us, it's needed to speak up and to listen, to act on intention. Hey, what to do? Hold on for the healing family. I'm for us, it's needed to speak up and to listen, to act on intention. Hey, we got work to do. Quickie. Thank you guys so much for listening. I know we've all been sitting and having this beautiful discussion, so thanks for letting me share with you. Thanks to Ashley and Malia for having me. So my partner sing, we're going to sing one more. Yeah, this song was inspired by a Rumi passage that contains the line,
Let the beauty of what you love be what you do. There are 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the ground. In the touch a lover gives when they just know, in being held how only a mother can hold, to walk at night trusting the light of the full moon's glow. It's all a song when offered truly from the soul. In the art of holding silence, in the dance of making sound, in the blessing that is breathing in and out, in the radical, the ritual, the wild and the devout, there's 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the ground. A bow in reverence to the water, earth and sky, just for a moment stepping outside of time, giving thanks to all that stokes the inner fire. Sometimes it's stillness that reminds us we're alive. In the art of holding silence, in the dance of making sound, in the blessing that is breathing in and out, in the radical, the ritual, the wild and the devout, there's 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the ground. There's 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the ground.
Emily's music is on the table.
You're all invited. Next Saturday, we're doing the I'm Like Music launch that I mentioned. And if,
This
Saturday.
Saturday.
Yeah. If any of you would like to come, you can actually be our guest. Just let Malaya know when you leave, because I'll put you on the guest list. Just me. And Emily and Seema and a bunch of other amazing artists will be there. Saturday, 7 to 11.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Emily, for that music. I'm going to take a moment to lose it for a second. I'm just so grateful that I get to be part of a community with all of you.
Yeah.
We're so much stronger together, and the reason why I'm so passionate about this work is because it's so hope-inducing. And I know that the medicine and the divinity that flows through all of us is what's changing the world, and it's just little bits at a time. So thank you for the divinity that flows through you and that you're sharing with us, and for each and every one of you as you show your light. So thank you.
Grateful for you.